Bravo,
Hoi, hola.
wasahlan.
Ahoy.
Sveik.
Привет.
Hallo.
Ciao. Salut. Hello.
And welcome to Policy Voices by Friends of Europe, an independent think tank with a difference. Each week from Brussels, we bring you powerful conversations with policy voices from around the world. Policy Voices talking policy choices.
Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of a 5-part series of Policy Voices exclusively dedicated to the European elections. I'm your host, Catarina Vila Nova. Each day this week, we are bringing you a brand new episode on 5 key election topics. I spoke with representatives from 5 parties on the issues that are going to dominate not only the elections, but also the next mandate. You already heard where each party stands on European security and defense, artificial intelligence, and climate change and the green transition. Today, we'll hear from the representatives on migration and fundamental rights. First on the show today, Simon McKeagney, the head of communications of the Greens. I asked him where the Greens stand on migration and fundamental rights and what policy proposals they want to see approved in the next mandate.
Yeah, this is one of the last big debates of this mandate, and it was a very difficult one. Quite shocking, really, to see how the far right, has had an impact on our migration policy, and also the link between linking that and security seems to be sort of the way it's going. Security focused migration policy is never a good one, and I think it's a real threat now in the future that we make this out to be something that's all about our defense, when actually, migration is something that has happened always in Europe. Fundamentally, it's brought brilliance to Europe. It's brought creativity. It's brought good ideas and great people. And we hope that Europe remains an open place. And I think it's quite shocking that Europe, founded on bringing down barriers and bringing down walls, we now have a lot of parties talking about rebuilding them again, whether that's fences to keep migrants out, or funding Frontex to ensure that pushbacks on the borders, or doing deals with, again, dictators in places like Tunisia, and standing beside far-right leaders and applauding billion-euro deals to ensure that refugees don't make it here. So I think the sort of promotion of the Migration Pact in the last mandate as seen as a success after all of the years of negotiation. I mean, you can negotiate an absolutely terrible deal and the deal ends, and you can be really proud of negotiating and getting the deal done, but that doesn't mean it's a good deal. It's still a bad deal. And we think, on a very, very fundamental basis, the majority of the Migration Pact is appalling. It's going to make lives worse for people. We're going to have issues like families separated and children in prisons at our border for long periods of time. We've connected it very much with deals with autocrats in places that have no real human rights regime for people trying to come into Europe. And so fundamentally, it's a real disappointment and a real shock. And I think we think we've solved it by coming up with a deal, but we know it's not going to solve migration at all. And the fact that we even think about it in those terms means we're missing the point. I mean, we're never going to stop people coming. So we need to provide very pragmatic, realistic approaches where there are safe routes to get to Europe. And if there were safe routes to get to Europe, we would not have this issue of people drowning in the Mediterranean and doing deals with third countries that will make life miserable for many, many people. So that's where we are. And I think if we're not careful, and if voters aren't careful, that swing further to the right in the next parliament, which is sort of predicted, let's see if it actually materializes or not, could have an even worse impact on these sort of policies, because we know that's what the far right wants. They didn't support the Migration Pact, not because they thought it was bad like us. They didn't support it because it wasn't draconian enough. It wasn't punishing enough for refugees coming into Europe, which is hard to fathom from our point of view. But that's what we're faced with. So the Greens will be fighting tooth and nail to, again, make sure that human rights, fundamental rights are protected, even to those people who are, not necessarily European citizens, but are trying to come into Europe. I think is crucially important for the next 5 years. We have this Migration Pact now in place. I think the next 5 years, it'll be really about seeing if this has actually any positive impact or not. We still think there needs to be a fair distribution in Europe. That's currently not the case. You can kind of opt out by paying other countries to take more migrants. We think this isn't really shared responsibility. I just hope we'll see some light at the end of the tunnel on this. But I think the next 5 years will be very much monitoring the Migration Pact, seeing if what improvements need to be made. When it comes to fundamental rights, which I didn't talk about in the first part of the question, I mean, there again, we face sort of an internal threat, which is in some countries, human rights are being rolled back, especially when it comes to the LGBTI community, women's rights, access to abortion. All of these things are critically important for the Greens. We had, I think, a few years ago, LGBT-free zones announced in places like Poland. We've countered it with the LGBT freedom zones as an initiative of the Greens. And I think that is still sort of a number one threat that we see. And again, if you have an uptick with the far right, we can be absolutely sure, as we've seen in Italy with Meloni's government rolling back of the rights for lesbian and gay couples when it comes to children. We've seen it with access to abortion. We've seen it in Hungary with LGBTI rights. We've seen it also with the rights of refugees in many countries across Europe. So yeah, fundamental rights have always been a priority of the Greens, and this will be something that will for sure be probably even more important, I think, in the next mandate if we see this uptick to further right and far right parties.
Listen now to David Lundy, the head of communications of the left, on his party's proposals and position on migration and fundamental rights.
Our position on the issue of migration and fundamental rights is that we're the group that champions the protection of migrants, refugees, people on the move, and their fundamental human rights. We want a humane migration policy, the EU to institute a humane migration policy with safe and legal pathways for people seeking asylum to be able to apply for asylum. The general approach has always been and will be in the future based on solidarity, on human dignity, and the shared responsibility of EU member states to uphold international human rights standards, which were agreed after the Second World War in the aftermath of one of the biggest disasters that humanity has ever experienced. And to see those rules that were agreed 70 plus years ago being chipped away at and overturned, as we have seen, by the centre-right capitulation and its capitulation to the far right, has been devastating, and we need to safeguard against that. The EU needs to establish safe and legal pathways for people on the move who want to seek asylum in the European Union, make sure those people are protected from exploitation and trafficking. We need to abolish Frontex. That has been a main part of our platform recently, and is something that we're going to keep working for. Frontex is the most expensive and biggest in terms of resources EU agency, and what we could use that money for is the protection of migrants and refugees, a proper search and rescue mission in the Mediterranean, for example, and investment in a fair asylum process so that people can get fair and timely decisions on their applications. We also need a solidarity mechanism for the fair distribution of asylum seekers among EU member states to alleviate the pressure on border countries and make sure this shared responsibility. We have also been active in visiting various detention centres and the conditions that people are held in across Europe over the last 5 years. And we think this detention centre system is not working, it's inhumane, and it should be replaced with better community-based reception alternatives that respect fundamental rights and human dignity. Overall, then, on the issue of fundamental rights, we want the Commission and the Commission President to be a much more robust defender of fundamental rights and European values, as they call them, over the next 5 years. That includes red lines around the defence of the rights of LGBTIQ plus people in the European Union, women's rights to abortion in the European Union and in all member states. We would like that right to abortion as something that is enshrined in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and the protection of minorities against the political attacks that a lot of minorities are subject to in many member states. I'm thinking here of Roma people, racialized people throughout Europe who face attacks on their safety by a lot of politicians who are seeking to whip up hatred for their own electoral gain. And we think the European Commission in particular has a special role in defending fundamental rights and in terms of its defence of the treaties role in Europe. And that includes, of course, the defence of rule of law and not making any compromises on the defence of rule of law within the European Union, because we know what the far right does. When you make compromises, they keep pushing, they see that as a victory, and we end up in a very bad situation if we start giving in to the far right.
Next, hear what Lena Düpont, MEP for the European People's Party, had to say on her party's priorities and policy proposals for migration and fundamental rights.
We were one of the first groups that really dived into the topic in this term. So we drafted and finally concluded also a paper on migration as EPP, as a kind of starting point for the pact discussion, where we clearly outlined how our approach to the pact itself, but to the question of asylum and migration in connection with fundamental rights, of course, is deemed. And I would also personally add that we had, I would say, 3 layers of understanding there, which was, of course, it's a political topic that has challenges for the European, the national, the federal level, sometimes for the regions and the member states as well. So we need to focus on it. But it also meant that, as a second point, that each and every level has to do what it can do in order to alleviate pressure, to organize it in a humane and comfortable way, and to have a look at the capacities at member states. And the last point, probably the most important one, was that we found the sentence as EPP outlining, let's say, the general approach to asylum and migration in connection to fundamental rights, which is, of course, humane with those who are in need of international protection, firm with those who are not. And this was basically also the idea of our policy approach in the pact negotiations. I mean, we used the 12 legislative acts to find the balance in the end. But I think that the slogan, humanity in order, in balance, is something that really drives the EPP when it comes to asylum and migration. Well, I guess a lot depends on not specifically new initiatives here, but more or less picking up and implementing what we had in the past, especially when it comes to asylum and migration, because now we need to focus on the implementation in the member states with the member states, implementing the fundamental rights monitoring mechanism that we introduced in the screening and in parts of the border procedure, implementing the infrastructure we need at the external border, which of course needs to follow European and national international standards, not only when it comes to the procedural question of fundamental rights, but also to the living conditions in there. This is basically something where I would say there's a lot ahead of us in that phase. A lot of work also in controlling the member states, in following and working together with the member states on that. And I personally specifically have a bit of it's an outlook. I wouldn't say it's actually a fear yet, but I think that we also need to focus a lot on the question of security in next term, specifically when it comes to the civilian side of security. Well, we also have a lot to do when you look at the rescEU mechanism, when you look at the Union crisis response mechanism, and so on and so forth. So I think that there will also be a lot of initiatives that we will need to draft in the upcoming term. And I hope that we also will do that, because it's a part of the Union's preparedness, which is, of course, also a bit connected to migration, to managing asylum within the Union. But it's a bit of a broader concept, like the Finns used to say, the preparedness union, which is something I would say is one of the hottest topics for the next term.
Next is Didrik de Schaetzen, the Secretary General of the ALDE Party.
It's very difficult, the migration debate, because it's been attacked on all fronts. You've got the populists that have the very big rhetorics on the fact that we have open doors and that we have the rights to block and to build walls, and this definitely doesn't adhere to our ideas. But at the same time, there are smugglers on the other side of the border that give the impression that that EU is the solution to escape misery and to escape war. And so we have to manage migration humanely, but with clarity and solidarity. We really need to have a very clear set of rules. And so the Migration and Asylum Pact, which was finally adopted, which was not an easy process. And again, this is one field where where the Liberals showed their level of compromise, and they bringing two big political families that often disagree. We managed to make it happen. We're very proud about that. We've shortened the period. It's faster to return for applicants. So indeed, it's a little bit back, and then you could blame me to say, well, you're having the same rhetoric as for the AI Act. But the reality is we had at the end of mandate two big policies packages that were adopted. And there is an element of given the power to be able to implement them now. And I think for the Migration and Asylum Pact, this is also one of these fields. These are quite some good achievements there, and we want to be given the mandate to implement them. One particularity of Liberals, if you're looking at it in our political family, is indeed to match the shortage we have in some employment with migration at that level, and that is part of the reflection we're very strong to push for in the Migration and Asylum Pact. So, first point, procedures has to be more uniform and shorter. I think that's essential, and also there should be a basis for compulsory relocation at one point or financial contribution for those who oppose it. So that would be one. On the defense of fundamental rights, there, as you know, this was a brief that was held by one of our commissioners, Vera Jourova. It's not easy to ensure that at the level of EU. You know that we felt very strong that the EU funds should be allocated with people that respect the fundamental rights. And so this is not something we're going to change our mind for. So we're going to still call that, and there should be no exceptions for no countries at the EU.
And lastly on today's show, Giacomo Filibeck, the Secretary General of the Party of European Socialists.
I know this is not always an easy topic, and by saying what I'm about to say, you may always attract a lot of criticism, but I prefer to speak honestly and to say the things for what they are. That we like it or not, migration is part of the European history, first and foremost, but I would say of the human history. It's the part of our world heritage and of our societies. And I would also like to say that citizens of migrant backgrounds actively participate positively in the economic and the cultural life of our countries. And this is something that we should be proud of. Because when migration is properly managed, then migration becomes an opportunity and a strength in a society. In these past years, after many years of debate, under the leadership of the Commissioner Ylva Johansson, a new pact of migration and asylum has been put forward. It tries to move away the European debate from the so-called crisis-driven approach in attempting to build an organized system where actions are based on solidarity and shared responsibility. From a purely social democratic point of view, we can clearly say that this is not the optimal pact. But since it is a pact, we had to confront ourselves with other players that have sometimes diametrically opposed views on this. So I would really like to thank Ylva Johansson for her determination to try to progress on this file after many years of stalling. In general, though, the migration policy must result in a fair, safe, and predictable approach grounded in the respect of human rights and on people's dignity. And this should be done also because it is the same European Union history that is characterized of protecting peoples in need. So we should not forget about who we are and what is the values we stand for. This is why, and I say it now clearly, we cannot accept those kind of special deals that Ursula von der Leyen, together with some prime ministers, have been promoting around, like in Tunisia, neglecting what is happening on the ground. And as well, we totally reject this notion of the Rwanda model, speaking of the United Kingdom ambition, but that we realize it is also in the manifesto of one of the major political movements in Europe, the EPP. because also this is against the fundamental rights Europe is built on. And to throw money at regimes that do not respect human rights is not a good migration management, in our opinion. What we need to do is to create legal routes, supporting inclusion in our local communities. And if you want something that is missing, but should be developed very carefully, is a true partnership with Africa, a true geopolitical partnership with Africa between the European Union and the African Union. In terms of more clear, more detailed aspect, we can say that with the implementation of the pact, then we will have hopefully a fair common EU migration system in place, which also helps fast asylum procedure, more human reception condition, and in general, trying to protect more human rights. But we also see that for a well-functioning system, return decisions must be carried out effectively in a safe and dignified manner, because this is really an important point when it comes to respecting human dignity. The other thing that I didn't mention before, but that is crucial to mention as a policy position, is that we have to keep fighting with the strength, all the strength that we have against the human traffickers and smugglers, because they are the enemy, first of all, of those migrants and of those human beings who are on the go. So legal routes for protecting the phenomenon, the human beings involved, and also for opportunities for labor migrants, because we cannot deny the demographic trends that we are experiencing in Europe. This is also an important priority for us. I conclude by saying that we are in favor of supporting the European mission for search and rescue in the Mediterranean. I don't say it only as an Italian that has been exposed every day to the tragedy of transforming our sea into a graveyard, but it's also because we cannot criminalize humanitarian assistance, as some right-wing governments would like to do.
And that was it for today's episode. We'll be back tomorrow with the 5th and final episode of this 5-part series of Policy Voices exclusively dedicated to the European elections. Tomorrow will be all about the EU budget and the cost of living, so make sure to subscribe to Friends of Europe's podcast to be notified as soon as the episodes are available. I'm Catarina Vila Nova and I'll be with you again tomorrow. Until then, goodbye.